3. Disrupting the left from within. The role of the Titoites is not confined to turning out in press and speeches a ceaseless stream of right-wing propaganda disguised in leftist phrases that is re-echoed through the world by the reactionary press and radio. Their third role, like that of their predecessors the Trotskyites, is to try and penetrate into the heart of the working class and progressive movement, to spy on it, confuse it, divide it, and disrupt it from inside. The open attacks of open reaction are complemented by the boring from within of covert reaction. The stronger the progressive and revolutionary movement grows, both in the countries of socialism and people's democracy, where the working people rule, and in the rear of capitalism, the more important for reaction becomes its Titoite secret weapon. The German Gestapo, even in the last days before the defeat of Hitler, saw the need to lay the basis for a comeback by a secret international within the left. Already on the 28th of September 1944, Paul Gully, correspondent of the Chicago Daily News and New York Post, reported from Switzerland, "This scum of the French population is now being trained for Bolshevik activity in the tradition of Trotsky's International under the personal orders of Heinrich Himmler. They are being instructed to tell their fellow countrymen that the present-day Soviet represents only a bourgeois degeneration of Lenin's original principles and that it is high time to return to sound Bolshevik ideology." This formation of groups of real Leninists is Himmler's most recent policy, aimed at creating a fourth international, amply contaminated by Nazi germs. It is such an international, with the control and leadership passed from the hands of Himmler of the Gestapo into the hands of Hoover of the U.S. Federal Bureau of Investigation (FBI), with the same scum, the same Nazi germs, the same platform that the Titoites represent today. The U.S. News and World Report of the 5th of January 1951 discusses the possibility of a big war in 1951. They weigh up the assets of American imperialism. They discuss the atom bomb, the American policy of scorching other people's earth. Then they come to Titoism, the kind of national communism sponsored by Marshal Joseph Broz Tito. They see it as another weapon against the Soviet Union. They explain that Tito-type communists are active within the communist parties of many countries. In all-out war they would make a bid for party control. They are seen by this organ of U.S. reaction as a fifth column inside the labor and progressive movement of the world, of special use to imperialism in time of war. In the people's democracies of Eastern Europe, the Titoites have tried and are trying to establish groups of agents centered around Belgrade inside the communist and workers' parties. We have seen something of their attempts along these lines in Hungary, Bulgaria and Albania as revealed in the Reich, Kostov and Gzok's trials. These activities have not in any way been confined to these three countries. In early August 1950, a trial of 12 agents of the Titoites was held in Bucharest, showing a wide network of espionage controlled from Belgrade and dating from the Red Army's liberation of Romania in 1944. In the same month, a group of Titoite agents was brought to trial in Prague, headed by Svikjevic, a former Yugoslav vice-consul in Bratislava. This network, too, had been established immediately after the liberation of Czechoslovakia. Intensive efforts have been made by the Titoites to gain a foothold in Poland. In Eastern Europe, the Titoites have attempted to gain an influence in the communist parties and indeed in the whole progressive movement, not only by recruiting former agents and reactionaries who are concealed inside the popular organizations, but also by putting forward distorted Marxist theories calculated to appeal to unstable and weaker elements inside the progressive movement. In Eastern Europe in general, their main platform has been one of narrow bourgeois nationalism. They know that for centuries the best elements of the Balkan and East European peoples have been fighting against national oppression, against the Turkish invaders, the old Austrian-Hungarian domination, and later against the imperialism of the West. They know that national minorities have been persecuted, and that reaction has kept its rule by developing and inciting people against people in national feud and hatred. But now a new era has opened up in the people's democracies. Real independence has been achieved at last. The domination of one people by another has ended. The economic and political basis for the old bourgeois nationalism has been abolished and the economic and political basis established for a new progressive socialist patriotism to be developed alongside real international solidarity, friendship and cooperation between the East European peoples. Moreover, it was the close friendship and cooperation with the Soviet Union that brought them liberation. This friendship and cooperation is helping them to build up economically strong independent states and is necessary in order that the newly won national sovereignty can be preserved. The Titoites hope to trade on the remnants of the old nationalism surviving in the minds of men. For the old bourgeois nationalism and chauvinism cannot be wiped out overnight. And even the memories of the old just democratic national liberation struggles can be distorted by the bourgeois nationalists into reactionary chauvinism, if a strong and ceaseless campaign of ideological explanation is not carried out. So the Titoites make bourgeois nationalism a principal platform in Eastern Europe. They try and incite hatred of the Yugoslav peoples against their Hungarian, Romanian and Albanian neighbors. They tried to foster a narrow Macedonian nationalism against the Bulgarian and Greek peoples and to put forward visions of an all-Macedonian grouping inside Tito Yugoslavia. They bring back to life all the old nationalists, Sedniks and Ustasi, great Serbs and nationalist Croats. They try above all to develop a narrow nationalism inside the left wing of the East European peoples and to direct it against the Soviet Union. It is the Soviet Union that made and is making national sovereignty possible for the people's democracies, but the Titoite line is first to separate the people's democracies from friendship with the USSR, and then to incite nationalist elements against the Soviet Union. Whilst Tito Yugoslavia is becoming a semi-colony of U.S. imperialism, the Titoites make their principal slogan in Eastern Europe, the fight against Soviet imperialism. This is truth exactly on its head, the Truman-Acheson ideological line. It is with this knowledge that Western reaction pays tribute to Tito's nationalism. Nationalism is still a potent force in Eastern Europe. The downfall of Marshal Tito would be a heavy blow to millions who secretly, or openly, side with him. The Times editorial on Titoism in Eastern Europe, the 20th of June 1949. Tito's movement lends heart to such hopes because its strength is drawn from nationalism. Mr. Eaton in Daily Telegraph, the 16th of June 1949. It is of the utmost importance to encourage the line of thought developed by Marshal Tito in opposing Russia's attempt to eliminate nationalism among the peoples of Eastern Europe. Hector McNeil in address to Canadian clubs and unit in Canada, quoted in the Times, the 25th of October 1949. In Eastern Europe, where the task before the peoples is to build socialism, where, in the people's democracies, national sovereignty has been achieved with the aid of the Soviet Union, where the sacrifices made by all those who fought throughout history for the national liberation of their countries have been rewarded. The platform of the Titoites is nationalism, that is, bourgeois nationalism. It is very interesting to compare with this the role of the Titoites in the colonial and dependent countries, particularly in India and Africa and in the Middle and Far East. Like their Trotskyite predecessors, the Titoites have been charged by their masters to play a role of special importance in these areas. The colonial people cannot be easily turned from their national liberation struggles by social democracy. Whilst the exploitation of the colonial peoples provides an economic basis for social democracy in the imperialist exploiting countries, there is no corresponding economic basis for social democracy in the colonial countries themselves. Imperialism, therefore, has had to look for new ideological weapons to divert the colonial and dependent peoples from anti-imperialist struggle. It is for this reason that already in the 1930s the Trotskyite agents of the bourgeoisie played a especially important disruptive role, not only inside the communist parties but inside socialist parties, where they existed, and inside the national movements. Abusing the ardent revolutionary spirit of these people, trading on the fact that in a number of colonial countries the theoretical level of the Marxist groupings was low and the progressive political organizations were weak, the Trotskyites, under ultra-leftist slogans, tried to break the broad unity of the anti-imperialist front, separate the vanguard from the masses, and divide the struggle of the colonial and dependent peoples from the struggle of the working class in the imperialist countries. They called for an immediate struggle for socialism. When the revolutionary movement had not yet reached such a stage, they branded in Ceylon, India, North Africa, the struggle against fascism as a maneuver of imperialism. They put forward bourgeois nationalist slogans which played into the hands of the fascists against white imperialism, etc. In this way great harm was done to the anti-imperialist struggle in Indochina, in Ceylon, in North Africa, in Indonesia. The Japanese secret police and the Gestapo set great store on the development of such groupings in the colonial lands. Today, on this issue too, Trotsky's mantle falls on Tito's shoulders. The national liberation movement has made giant strides forward. Whole vast areas have won their independence. The working class has stepped or is stepping into the leadership of the liberation struggle. In many colonial and dependent countries, strong communist parties have developed or are developing. In all these countries the task is the struggle for national independence, the struggle against imperialism. The working class is faced with the task of building, under its leadership, the unity of the overwhelming majority of the people, workers, peasants, petty bourgeoisie and national bourgeoisie, against foreign imperialism, the feudal landlords and that section of the bourgeoisie, the big bureaucratic bourgeoisie, who have sold out to imperialism. The people's democratic rule, the new regime of people's democracy for which the colonial and dependent peoples are striving, will not be in its first stage a dictatorship of the proletariat. The tasks of the revolution are, in the first instance, anti-imperialist, anti-feudal. The revolution has not yet got socialist tasks. So what is the main platform of the Titoites in the colonial and dependent countries? It is to preach immediate socialism, immediate socialist revolution. by urging the people to skip essential stages in the revolutionary struggle. They are trying to draw the proletarian vanguard far in advance of the masses, to provoke them in the traditional manner of agents provocateurs, to lead them forward too far and fast and thus lay them open to be repressed and broken by imperialism. Wherever the level of Marxist understanding is not yet high, the Titoites seek to confuse the people and the revolutionary groupings by high-sounding, ultra-revolutionary phrases. They try to cash in on the people's intense revolutionary fervor, their readiness for struggle and sacrifice, in order to distort, divert, divide and disrupt the anti-imperialist struggle, and transform the people's desire for national independence into blind bourgeois nationalism. This is why the Titoites are especially active in their efforts to contact the colonial people. It is now clear why already in 194,546, Cardle, posing as an expert in international affairs, made a special study of the colonies, why the Yugoslav embassies in the imperialist countries contacted the revolutionary organizations, asking for information on the colonial struggle, why the Yugoslav Foreign Office has a special section dealing with colonial problems, and asks for every publication in the colonial world and especially the publications of the left-wing organizations. This is why the Titoites went out of their way to invite colonial revolutionary leaders to Belgrade in the post-war period. This is why the Yugoslav embassies in Britain, Belgium, France, Holland, etc., have as a special task to contact the colonial students in these countries in order to inveigle them to visit Yugoslavia. And this is why the imperialists, who are alarmed at the slightest contact of the colonial peoples with the Soviet Union and people's democracies, go out of their way to encourage and promote contact with Tito Yugoslavia. The Titoites made a special drive on India. They sought to advise the Indian communist movement that Belgrade was the new center of the world revolutionary movement. They tried to promote ill will between Indian revolutionaries and the British and other communist parties. They sent their delegates, including De Deer, a leading Titoite, to attend the Second Congress of the Indian Communist Party. They put forward both publicly and off the record what they called Cardle's new development of Marxist theory, the intertwining of the national liberation struggle and the socialist revolution. They quoted and requoted Cardle's report to the first meeting of the Communist Information Bureau as a basis for development in India. These were the points that they stressed. It can be said that the development of the national liberation uprising and the people's power in Yugoslavia represents a specific example of the linking up of a national liberation war with a democratic people's revolution under the leadership of the working class striving in its development to a higher socialist form. The process of the development of the people's democratic revolution interblended with the socialist forms which today have become predominant. Cardle's report to Communist Information Bureau, August 1947, reprinted in Indian Communist, January 1948. What did this mean? It meant that the Titoites were using all their influence to persuade Indian revolutionaries to embark on a leftist course of action that would inevitably break the unity of the anti-imperialist Indian peoples, divorce the vanguard from the masses of the people, isolate the leading section of the working class, and open it up to oppression and persecution by reaction. The policy that Titoites advanced was in direct contradiction to the correct path forward for the Indian revolutionary movement, as set out in the historic draft program of the Communist Party of India published in April 1951, and the statement of policy which followed it. The Titoites also tried to gain an influence in the Communist Party of Ceylon. Here they contacted the Trotskyite groupings of Ceylon and supplied them with anti-Soviet slanders, but the Ceylon communists exposed their role and the Titoite propagandists were utterly routed. They made especial efforts to contact African Marxists and the African national movement through the medium of African students studying in the West, and the same with the students of Vietnam. They offered special radio receiving sets for reception of Yugoslav news agency reports to colonial movements. They made desperate but utterly vain attempts to win Chinese support for their anti-Soviet, bourgeois nationalist line and to contact Chinese students abroad. Until they were exposed, they tried to use their position in the international democratic organizations, the International Union of Students, World Federation of Trade Unions, World Federation of Democratic Youth, etc., to contact and indoctrinate the colonial people. For Western imperialism, therefore, the Titoites were a weapon of special importance for the disruption of the anti-imperialist struggle. So the imperialists dreamed of new national communist groupings in the colonies and dependent countries. The communist danger in Southeast Asia will be the main issue before the Conference of Commonwealth Ministers when they meet at Colombo. Communism has so far found some difficulty in coming to terms with the new nationalism, which today is perhaps the most potent force in Southeast Asia. There is indeed some evidence for the belief that quite a new communist animal may eventually emerge from this part of the world. For some time, for instance, there has been a strong Trotskyist movement in Ceylon. In Burma, the communists have split into two groups. National communism existed in Southeast Asia even before Tito successfully defied Moscow. It is too early to say what effect this is likely to have, but at the very least Tito's survival can only be an encouragement to the dissident groups. Observer, the 25th of December 1949, the State Department exerted, and still exerts, every effort to extend the network of Tito-Yugoslav legations throughout the world of dependent states, of which the Yugoslav legation in Delhi is to be the principal center. The New Delhi correspondent of the Daily Telegraph reported early in 1950 that the U.S. government was going to encourage the establishment of Titoite missions throughout Asia. The Belgian journal Libre Belgique, the 14th of January 1950, wrote, in its future actions, vis-a-vis the Asiatic states, Washington is counting on two factors, nationalism and national communism of the Tito type. American experts have become convinced that the latter formula would be perfectly compatible with the aid that the USA intends to give to these countries. An American action of this type has already begun in Burma, where American agents are actually supporting anti-Stalinist communist groupings and are trying to organize a common bloc of these groups with the government parties. If this action is crowned with some success, the United States would even go as far as envisaging the creation of a center whose essential task would be to check the action of the pro-Soviet elements. By early 1951, the Americans were pressing hard for the establishment of a Yugoslav legation in Indonesia. What could be clearer? To combat communism in Asia and throughout the colonial and dependent world, imperialism needs an instrument which will look A, nationalist and B, revolutionary, but whose real purpose will be anti-communist and anti-Soviet. They need an imperialist line dressed up in anti-imperialist phrases. The answer is Tito and the Titoites. The activity of the Titoites is not confined to the people's democracies and the colonial independent countries. There is hardly a country under imperialist rule where, in some form or other, the Titoites are not working alongside the domestic reactionaries, sometimes as secret agents inside the communist parties, sometimes more openly in socialist or nationalist organizations, sometimes in Trotskyite grouplets, but always against the unity and against the interests of the working class and the working people. In Western Germany they tried for a period to work underground, inside the Communist Party. But when they were exposed, they turned to the formation of a phony Communist Party on chauvinist lines with all the aid and encouragement of the Western occupation forces. The so-called Independent German Communist Party was founded at Dusseldorf on the 23rd of July 1950 under the leadership of a Titoite, Chap, recently expelled from the Communist Party. The Manchester Guardian correspondent in Western Germany wrote the 24th of July 1950, the Tito split in Germany is, according to Herr Chap, due to three main reasons. He and his followers refused to accept the Oder, nice line. They further refused to accept the political directives of a foreign country, Soviet Russia. Herr Chap said that his party would take the title of the Independent Workers' Party. It would be prepared to make common cause with the Social Democrats, but would advocate far more radical social reform. Titoism is a model for this new party. The party has plenty of links with the Socialist Unity Party in the Soviet zone, but would naturally maintain them on a strictly underground basis. Herr Chap, reporting the conference, which was held secretly, to a New York Herald Tribune correspondent, said that his party condemned Russia's prisoner of war policy. What did the imperialists need in Western Germany? They wanted something to complement amongst the workers the activities of the right-wing social democratic leaders whose influence was waning, something that would talk left but would have a nationalist line directed against the Potsdam Agreement and the Soviet Union, something that could be the basis for espionage activity inside the Socialist Unity Party of the Eastern Zone. Here was a new sort of communism that could bring tears of joy to imperialist eyes. The long-term possibilities of a really strong independent communism fighting a Moscow-controlled movement in Western Europe stirs all sorts of happy political visions in the minds of Western elite officials. New York Herald Tribune, Bonn correspondent, the 4th of August 1950. In France, the Titoites tried at first to find a foothold inside the Communist Party, but were quickly exposed. They carried out special activity, but with no success, amongst the Yugoslav émigré population in France. With social democracy badly compromised, they were trying in 1951 to form an independent Third Force party. Founded by the well-known Trotskyists Jean Rous and Yves Deschazels, ex-assistant secretary of the Socialist Party, it called itself the Independent Socialist Left and claimed to stand for a democratic socialism which will replace both social democracy and Stalinite communism. It collaborates with the Coordination Center for Socialist and Democratic Action, of which Louis Dulmaz, ardent Titoite propagandist and tourist in Tito, Yugoslavia, is a leading member. In Italy, too, the Titoites tried at first to penetrate the Communist Party. Then they turned their attention to the Nenni Socialist Party, once more without success. They were particularly vociferous in calling for provocative forms of political demonstration that would have furnished the de Gasperi government with a much-needed pretext for repressive action. The Yugoslav embassy in Italy turns out a vast quantity of propaganda. Bribes are freely used in trying to attract delegations. 2 members of the Italian Communist Party were expelled for maintaining contacts with the Titoites. On the publication of the news, the local police Carabinieri chief called to congratulate them and offer them his full support. This made them see very rapidly the real role of the Titoites. Titoites have been active amongst the Spanish Republican exiles, trying to split and confuse the Republican movement. They were one of the sources of information on the Spanish Republicans in France that led to the recent mass arrests by the French government. Even Franco has now seen the use of Tito. The Falange organ, Arriba, wrote in 1951, Tito is not a real communist, while the Franco organ, Geraldo de Aragon, explained, it is expedient for the Western world that Tito should continue to be called a Marxist. The work of the Titoites in Britain will be dealt with in a later chapter. How can the efforts of the Titoites to penetrate, spy on and disrupt the left-wing movement from within be summarized? What methods are common to the Titoite groups in all countries? The Titoites tried, in the first place, to penetrate into the communist parties, to establish secret groups within them and to develop a distorted Marxist theory, calculated to put these parties at the mercy of capitalism. But after the Information Bureau resolution of June 1948, and still more clearly after the revelations of the Reichenkostoff trials, the role of the Titoites was exposed, and though their efforts to maintain secret groups within the communist parties were, of course, continued, the Titoites were, in general, thrown out of the communist organization, while those sincere communists who had fallen under their influence before their exposure came to see how they had been misled. So today the Titoites, having failed to carry out their aim of organizing a split in the world communist movement, are endeavoring to carry on their work inside social democratic and nationalist organizations, and also by the formation of little splinter grouplets, independent socialist bodies, reminiscent of the countless Trotskyite splinter grouplets of the 1930s, Bolshevik, Leninist, Internationalist, National Communist, etc., etc., all of which with the aid of the police of their various countries try to disrupt working class and popular unity. What is the ideology of these Titoite groups? There is no ideology, there are no principles in the Titoite groups. From country to country, from place to place, from time to time their slogans change, not with a changing situation, nor with a changing relation of class forces, but according to what is expedient to help capitalism inside the progressive movement. Whatever is against the interests of the working class, whatever is anti-Soviet, anti-communist, against unity of the working class, against peace, is served up in pretentious ultra-revolutionary pseudo-Marxist language as the slogan of the hour. The only thing common to the Titoites, as to the Trotskyites before them, is their utter lack of principle. In the people's democracies of Eastern Europe, a certain bourgeois nationalism survives in the minds of even progressive elements. So in these countries bourgeois nationalism becomes an essential part of the Titoite program. In these countries, in the 194,749 period, the main progressive tasks were to carry forward the march to socialism, fight for the leading position of the working class, cement the alliance of the working class with the working peasantry, isolate and restrict the kulaks, prepare the working people for intensifying class battles, strengthen the leading role of the Communist and Workers' parties. So the Titoites, overtly and covertly, taught the opposite. They developed what they called new advances in Leninism. They taught the opposite of Lenin, rejected the leading role of the working class, rejected the need to differentiate amongst the peasantry, taught the need to hide the Communist Party and to dissolve it into the People's Front, taught that the class struggle would die away. When the struggle for socialism was on the order of the day, the Titoites preached nationalism. When socialism could only be built with the aid and friendship of the USSR, the Titoites preached enmity to the Soviet Union. But in the colonial countries they changed their slogans. In these countries the revolutionary struggle had at this stage as its main tasks the fight against imperialism and against feudalism. Further periods of struggle and further stages of struggle were necessary before the fight for socialism would be on the order of the day. So here the Titoites preached socialism, the intertwining of the national liberation struggle with the struggle for socialism, where a national liberation is the main immediate task. The Titoites preach socialism, but where the next task is the advance to socialism, the Titoites preach nationalism. Here they tried to hold back the revolutionary advance. There they tried to break the revolutionary movement by advancing provocative leftist slogans, destined to split the movement and cut off and destroy the vanguard. Everywhere they aid imperialism. Thus, like their Trotskyite predecessors, and along with the old Trotskyites, with whom in most cases ranks have been fused, they have no principles, but only one standpoint: enmity to the working class and socialism. The Marxism which they preach can only be described as police Marxism, MI5 Marxism. It consists in expressing the aims of imperialism in a pseudo-Marxist jargon. Have they a platform, an aim? Yes. It is the aim of their masters, the restoration of capitalism, subordination to American imperialism, war against the lands of socialism and people's democracy. But this is the platform of the inner ring of Titoites, and they dare not make it known to their supporters. Thus it was with the Trotskyite conspirators in the Soviet Union. They did not dare to make known their platform even to their own leading supporters. Naturally, the Trotskyites could not but hide such a platform from the people, from the working class. And they hid it not only from the working class, but also from the Trotskyites as a whole, and not only from the Trotskyite rank and file, but even from the leading group of the Trotskyites, consisting of a small handful of 30 or 40 people. When Radek and Pyatakov asked Trotsky's permission to call a small conference of Trotskyites, 30 or 40 people, to inform them of the character of this platform, Trotsky forbade them, saying that it was inexpedient to talk of the real nature of the platform even to a small group of Trotskyites, as such an operation might cause a split. Stalin, report at plenum of the CC of the CPSU, B. the 3rd of March 1937. In the same way the real platform of Tito, Kartal, Rankovic, Gilles, has been concealed from all but the innermost ring of their immediate associates, agents of imperialism. And to keep the support of their wider associates, to try and attract sincere workers who have not yet seen through their maneuvers, to try and confuse and divide the workers and their allies, the Titoites, like the Trotskyites, put forward, without principle, any concatenation of phrases they consider useful for the moment. All the old Trotskyite catchphrases are repeated. Stalin has departed from Leninism. The Soviet Union is a bureaucracy. The Communist parties are the instrument of Soviet foreign policy. There is nothing in Gilles, Pichade, Cardinal, Rankovic and Tito that they could not have culled from the works of Trotsky as translated into German under Hitler and disseminated with the aid of the Gestapo. But the Titoites trade on the fact that large sections of the labor and progressive movement did not know or have forgotten the role of the Trotskyites. Stalin, in the speech quoted above, showed that Trotskyism in the 1930s had ceased to be a trend in the working class. Trotskyism has ceased to be a political trend in the working class. It has changed from the political trend in the working class which it was 7 or 8 years ago into a frantic and unprincipled gang of wreckers, diversionists, spies and murderers, acting on the instructions of the intelligence services of foreign states. Stalin, report at plenum of the CC of the CPSU, the 3rd of March 1937. It is such an unprincipled gang that the Titoites are today. Their platform, known only by an inner ring, is the restoration or maintenance of capitalism, world domination of U.S. imperialism, war against the Soviet Union and the people's democracies. Their immediate slogans are a hodgepodge of pseudo-left phraseology aimed at confusion, division, disruption, and directed against whatever is in the interests of the working class and the working people. Reich made it clear. In the course of his trial, the president of the court asked him, "You say that you pursued a Trotskyist policy. What was the standpoint of this group?" Reich replied, "I could outline the essence in a few words, by saying that it was a refutation and disruption of everything which is in the interests of the revolutionary working class movement, on a political basis that completely lacked all principle." Reich's evidence, verbatim report of Reich trial, p. 39. Thus the Titoites today pursue within the world progressive movement the same 3 roles as the Trotskyites between the wars, of whom they are the successors: 1. As an instrument of the war plans of imperialism. 2. As an arsenal of anti-communist, anti-Soviet, anti-progressive slanders dressed up in left-wing language. 3. As a weapon of imperialism for the penetration of the communist and progressive organizations and movements, for spying on them, for confusing them and disrupting them from inside.